Welcome to Intro to GitHub, no terminal required, and I'm Jessica Parsons. So to get started, this is what we'll cover in this workshop. First, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between Git and GitHub. They are not the same thing. What your GitHub profile and account settings are, very briefly, understanding what repositories are and how they work, how to work with files inside the GitHub web UI, how to make your first pull request, and then how to find and choose projects and communities to make contributions to. So, first thing, talking about what the difference is. So Git is a version control software that you can run on your own computer or on a server. The purpose of it is to save multiple versions of your work. You can do it working entirely on your own. Maybe you're doing it just because you want to save versions of your work, or you're working on changes in one place, but you don't want to, it's like save as made significantly more functional. But it's also a little bit complicated. And even if people tell you it's easy, it's because they've been practicing it for a long time. It's kind of hard for anybody when they first start. But GitHub is actually a web-based service on top of Git that is made for storing, sharing, and collaborated on projects that are managed with Git. Their initial tagline for the product when they first released in 2008 was social code hosting. So it was like the idea of making coding social and contributing with others on your code. So inside GitHub, you have a profile. It is, in a way, kind of a social media format for code. And you have a profile just like you would in other things. So that profile has information about you, including your repositories that you might have saved to your account, contributions that you've made in the last year, which can take all kinds of forms. And we'll talk about some of those: reviewing other people's work, filing issues, making actual changes yourself in commits and pull requests. And we'll talk about what all of those things mean in a minute. But it's got a lot of different parts to it. And you can go into your settings and change some of those things. We're not going to do that now, but just to kind of tell you about some of them. I didn't copy the newest UI for this because the list is much, much longer and settings is way at the bottom. So you can, in there, you can add information about your profile. In fact, there's also included in there, oh, can I make this go away? Yeah. There's a checkbox where you can say you're available for hire. If you're looking for work, that's something you can put in there on your profile. You can set your notification preferences, set up two-factor authentication, which is always wise. You can block other users like you might on other social media. And you can also, change to dark mode or other color formats for your UI. You actually have quite a few options, more than usual. But that's kind of an aside part, just to kind of let you know what's out there. But the core of Git, the main unit of what you're working with, I would say, is a repository. And this is true within Git, and then it's also true in GitHub and any other services that are built on Git. A repository, which is often called a repo for short, is what they call a project or a folder. Essentially, if you're looking at it on your computer, it's a folder. And very often online, it looks the same way. It contains all of the project's files, and it stores each file's revision history. So that's kind of what makes it different from a regular old folder. And on GitHub, each repository has its own page and includes several other features for collaboration. These things are not built into Git. That's something that's added on by GitHub. So an example, if we go to a repository like the Write the Docs one, for example. So I'm going to actually go to that one. Oops, I must have written it wrong. All right, I'm not going to do that one. I'll just do one of mine. So like the example we have here, in a repository, oh, there's no hyphens in it. Let's just do that. There's a variety of information about the repository in here that is not built into Git, stuff that has information. The code, that you'll find in a local Git thing, but issues, pull requests, discussions, actions, security insights, watching, forking, adding stars, all of those things are things that GitHub builds onto Git and creates those things for the purposes of collaborating with others primarily. So there's lots of different information that you can find out about a repository from its main page. And the way that the URLs are structured, it's always made so that it has the username and then the name of the repository in the file path in the URL. So has all sorts of features added onto it. In the file listing section, it has all the different files that are inside of that repository. Each row contains the name of the file or folder and a description of the last change, which is called a commit message, and when that change was made. This is something that when I first started looking at repositories, I found it kind of frustrating because I felt like this little thing here should be explaining to me what each of those files were for, but it's not. It's telling you what was the very last change that was made on it, what message was written when there was a change made on that file or folder, and when. And GitHub itself treats some of these files as special based on their file names. So if you have a code of conduct or a contributing guide or a license, it treats that in a different way. It highlights it in other parts of the repository. A pull request template affects what a pull request looks like, and we'll talk about that a little later. And the README actually shows up right on the README front page, on the repo front page. So if you have a README in a folder or in the top level of a repository, it puts that file, the contents of the file, directly below the files in it. So like that one has an example of a README. This one has a README, and when you scroll down, you can see the whole README for it. It's like an introduction to the repository, or if you're inside of a nested folder, you can also put in a README and it'll have an introduction to that group of files inside that folder. You'll see this one also has a license thing. So if there's a license file up in here, the contents of that license show up down here. So it takes certain files based on their names and does things with it to add some tools for collaboration and learning more about the repository. So now that you kind of have a sense of the different parts of the repo, we're going to start looking at how to actually work with those files inside of the repo. The first thing we're going to do, and I think you can follow along with these, and I'll kind of go a little bit sort of slowly through this as I'm going, but we'll also have a chance after we go through several steps to go through and do them again. So if you fall a little behind on that, we'll catch back up. Or if you're in the room, you can ask Catherine, or if you're online, you can ask a question in chat. So different people who can help you as we go along. So, and also feel free to, if you're online or in the room, raise your hand and ask a question, stop me along the way. So if you're in the room and you raise your hand, I don't know, you have to come around to the computer and ask your question or something so I can hear or repeat it. So to create a new repo, assuming first that you're in GitHub, so you've gone to github.com, you've logged in, you might be on the initial profile page when you've logged in, you're still going to have this little plus button up at the top. So you can click on that and choose new repository. So you're going to make a brand new repository. And when you do that, they give you these options of like randomly generated names, which is why I have these weird repo names like Fuzzy Engine and Animated Telegram. So this one has Stunning Carnival as a choice that you can put in if you want, or you can call it something else. You can call it My First Repo or whatever you want. They just generate random ones to give you something that won't be the same as something else you have, something like that. I have to choose an owner because I'm in a lot of different orgs. If you're all just you, then you can just put in your username, or it might be there already. There are templates for repositories, which we're not going to worry about here, but that is something that you might find useful sometimes in the future. There's a place to put the description, and then you can make a repository public or private. And actually for years, you couldn't do private ones without paying for GitHub, but now you can do them for free. So that's nice. For this, I would say it's better to make it public because then you have a chance to make contributions to each of your repositories. You can make it private later if you want to. It won't live that long here in this workshop, so you don't have to worry about somebody going and seeing your first commits to your first repo in here, if this is your first. And it also has some things that it offers to make for you as an initialization of your first repository. So you can have it add a README file, and that will just start that file for you and put that into your repository. It's particularly nice when you're working in the GitHub UI to have it make a README file for you, because if you don't, it's hard to add files initially. So it's good to have at least one file made in the creation of the repository. So I do that by just checking a README file, because you're always going to need one of those. Git ignore is for when you're working locally, and we don't need to worry about that right now. And license is for choosing what kind of license you might have. If it is an open source license, there's lots of choices. They actually have some pretty good docs about what those different licenses mean and what it means in terms of what other people can do with your repository. We're not going to worry about that right now, so you can just skip that part and just say create repository. So got that one. So this is the first step that we've done. So hopefully you've gotten through that part. You made a new repository. You've given it a name, and you can write a description in there. You've marked it as public. Some parts of this are going to be older UI screenshots because I didn't update them, but they look similar enough that I think you'll be able to find your way. Check the box to add a README file and create your repo. Is there anyone who's stuck on that before we continue on? Anyone have an interesting repo name they want to share? It's all right, you don't have to.
Nobody seems stuck here.
All right, cool. Thank you. All right, so now once we're in the repository, the one that you've just created, my stunning carnival, you see it's made a README file for me. The first one that they do, they call that an initial commit. We'll talk about what a commit is in a second. And basically the README file is very simple. It just says the name of the repository. Crispy Telegram. Oh, I like that one. That's a good repo name, actually. And so, yes, we've got this file in here already. We're going to add another file. So to do that, you'll click here. Depending on what you did previously or the size of your screen, sometimes that'll be a plus and sometimes it'll be add file. So one or the other, that's where you're going to pick. It'll be on that same row next to that code button, and you'll create a new file. So we'll do that. And when you do that, this opens up a code editor or text editor. Doesn't have to be code, directly in your UI, in your web browser. And so in here, we have a place to name the file. So I can just call this my file. I'm just going to call it a text file. And then you can put information in here. This is content of my file. So this is a file that's going to be saved right inside the repository. I put in the name of it. I put in the content of my file. And these things you can actually change the settings of if you want to when you're working. It has to do with whether when you hit the tab button, whether it puts in spaces or tabs. We won't get into that discussion. And whether the lines wrap. You can actually write it so that the lines just go on forever and ever when you write a long paragraph. Usually when you're doing writing, you probably want to wrap them. So then we've created the new file. You picked your name, you type that in. Now you're ready to commit it. So committing is a Git term. That's something that even if you're working Git locally or in any other Git-based tool, committing is something that happens in all of those. And that is basically taking a file. It's not just about saving. Now in the web UI, you can't really save without committing, but in other contexts, you might save a file and then have to commit it, which is basically putting it into your version control. So in this case, inside the web UI, you're just going to commit changes, which is essentially like saving because you can't save your progress without committing when you're working in the web UI. And it suggests a commit message for you, which is just to create that file. You can put in another message if you want to, and more info here. This gives us, if you're working in your own repository, it can be nice to leave notes for yourself when you look at it later, or if you're working in someone else's, giving information about the purpose of what you've just done helps others when they're looking at, hey, how did this file get here and why? And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to commit directly to the main branch. So just making a regular commit, this part with pull requests, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So just go ahead and commit the changes. And assuming everybody got along with that, it's pretty straightforward. You can see now in the file list, we have the new file in here. And if I click on it, I can see the contents of that file. So looks pretty normal. So going along here, adding that. Now, that's what you can do for text files. And to be honest, Git is really made for text files, not just like the TXT format, but code, writing, anything that's written in text is really what Git does best because it treats that text in such a way that it only looks at the differences between lines. What it's not quite so made for is for binary files like images and videos and other things that if you were to like open up the text of one of those items, it's just a bunch of gobbledygook characters because it's not actually meaningful text. And if you changed an image from, 300 by 500 size image to a 500 by 700 size image, Git doesn't really have any way to know what exactly the changes are besides you put in a new file. So it's a little bit weird that way, and it handles it a little bit differently, but you can actually upload those kinds of files. So as we show in here, they're called binary files because essentially they're not in human readable text. They're stored in ones and zeros, essentially. And so if you want to upload an image or something like that, then you can go into here, and you click add file and upload files. And I'm realizing too that I forgot to queue up some images to upload in here, but I should have something that I can use. I think I have a whole bunch of emojis stored. They'll be very tiny images, but so you can go into
Jessica,
yeah.
would a PDF file be considered a binary file?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, which is
So-
kind of odd because it does have text in it, but the way that it's saved is not actually as the text. When a PDF file is saved, it's saved as a binary file as well. So if you need to put a PDF up into a repository, you're going to do the upload files. If you can't type it as plain old text, it has to be uploaded. And similarly, a Word document, I don't think that that would work as a binary file. I think there's enough extra information, even though you can extract text from it. I don't think that GitHub would, I don't think you can create a new file and just give it like a doc or docx extension on the end of it and it'll know what to do with it. So yeah, all those kinds of things that aren't just regular text, that's going to be where you upload a file. And so you go in there, you can drag them in or you can choose your files. And let's see if I can do that. There we go. That's a good one. So you can choose actually more than one to upload. As you choose them, it'll add them as a stack here. And I'm going to add that information into it. You can add an additional description. This part is just the same as if you're saving text. And then again, just commit directly like you would normally. Sometimes this might take a while if it's uploading a lot. But now you can see, got my README, I've got my text file, and now I've got this Foxwave GIF. I love it. It's like coming out of the bottom of the window. So yes, now you can upload those files, and if they are files that could be seen inside the browser easily, like many browser-supported image files, probably not a video. A lot of times they will actually render it inside the browser, but sometimes it might not. Sometimes it might just say it's this kind of file. If it's a binary file that it doesn't know what to do with, it'll just tell you this is a binary file. But GIFs, JPEGs, PNGs, those will all have, they'll get rendered in the browser. So we have that one. So that's how you would upload a file. And so now that you've uploaded one, and you've created one, now let's look at editing them. So if we go into the repository, I can edit any one of these files, and I'm actually going to edit the README. Now, you'll notice that the README extension on it is .md, which stands for Markdown, which you may or may not be familiar with in this group. I think Write the Docs people tend to know Markdown, and it is getting more and more widespread, or you'll see Markdown-like syntax in things like Slack and stuff like that, where that is, and there's a link for it in the slides. There's a link to GitHub's Markdown guide, which it's basically, you can add little symbols around the text that you're entering, and many tools, including GitHub's UI, will render those as HTML elements. So it can be, if you put number signs before, it'll change it into a heading. You can, and those headings actually behave very specially inside of GitHub as well. It creates a little menu for it. It makes those ones linkable. It actually does quite a few things that aren't even built into Markdown. And then you can also do things like styling your text. So that link shows you a lot of the different things that you can do. And in here is just a sample of some sample code that we could do. So this is the first part that's actually already in the README. So if I go in here and I click the edit button, the little pencil one to edit it, I've now got this text editor. And you can see that they put the name of the repository just by default in there as a first level heading. And if you click the preview button, you can see what that looks like, which we already knew because we saw it in the other page. And then you can put in, so like if you put underscores, single underscores or single asterisks, but I kind of like to follow sort of the pattern that Slack has, where underscores are italics and asterisks are bold. So I always end up using underscores for my italics and asterisks for my bold. But you have in Markdown, you have to use 2 for bold. So like I'll say this is my new repo. And they do a little bit to kind of give you hints about like this is bolded because it's a heading, and it puts those things that are in between underscores as italics. It put things that are 2 asterisks as bolded, and you can see if I only have 1 asterisk on either side, it does italics. So, and that can actually be useful in a few places where sometimes if you're using underscores or asterisks, it actually does something in whatever tool that you're working in. that a character actually has some functionality in that tool, and then you can just use the other character, and all that you need is 1 for italics and 2 for bold. So that would be an example of that. And then there's also, and you can see this in the slide, a format for creating links. So in Markdown, those links start with and this is my favorite mnemonic for this, because a lot of times people have trouble remembering, but the favorite one that I've ever learned is the first part, which is the text of the URL. So this is the text, goes inside the square brackets. And then what follows is the URL. And you could copy paste it, and the mnemonic for that I like is squirrel, because square comes first and then the URL. So the URL is the URL and the first part comes in the square. So you get the square first and then the URL, it's squirrel. And then if you do the same thing with an exclamation point, this is alt text. So that's the text that gets readed by screen readed. Did I just say readed? That's read by screen readers when you come to an image. And then in here, and I'm just going to put in, see if I can get it to work. There are a variety of image placeholder services out there that basically, if you give it, you put in the URL, and then the dimensions of the width and the height of the image that you want, and it'll just generate an image for you that fits those dimensions. I used Place Kitten for years and just discovered that that doesn't work anymore, but Place Cats does. So let's see if it works. There, yay! So this will give you a preview while you're editing. So you can go, oh, did my URL work right? Or did I accidentally do it wrong? Check your preview and you can see whether it worked properly or not. And you can even, in the preview, test the link. Does this actually go to github.com? It does. And you can see that the image actually is loading, all those kinds of things. So you can, the preview can be really useful when you're working in Markdown. There's a couple other image formats that work sometimes, but Markdown is really, and this I would say is part of one of the reasons why Markdown is so popular, is because it really became popularized inside of GitHub and open source contributions, because just straight out of the box, you use Markdown and inside of GitHub, all your stuff gets formatted, and that can be really nice. So anyone stuck with like working and making some things in Markdown, you can just type in whatever you like into your new file to edit it. Then, like before, you're going to commit your changes. And can put that in. I'm going to keep committing directly to the main branch and commit my changes. And there it is. And this now, by default, when you view a file, shows the preview view, but you can also swap over to code and see the code view. So, and you can see that over in the file tree here, or if you go back to the root of the repository, you can see, because it's a README file, it shows it on the first page and it's now been updated. And you can go into that file to edit it. They also put a little shortcut to edit right there on the README page. So, all right, did that all make sense? Looks like we don't have anybody stuck. Okay.
Yeah,
this
I think you
part's
got 'em.
pretty straightforward. There's my sample of another place cat. Now, putting files into new folders. This one's a little bit strange, and I actually didn't find it initially back in the day. So inside of your repository, let's say I have this myfile.txt, and I have it in the root of my repository, but I don't want it to be there in the main folder. I actually want to make a new folder and put that file into it. So the tricky thing here is you click to edit the file, and you can change the title of the file right here, but you can also type in and so you type in the name of your folder you want it to be in, and then slash, and it automatically says, and you can delete it too. Kind of weirds me out, but so I'm just going to put text files and a slash. And so now this myfile.txt, when I commit it, it's going to be nested now inside of another file, or folder rather. And so they consider it a renaming, because technically these files aren't stored in actual folders. What makes them in folders is the path that leads to them. So it's changing the path of this file. And that's essentially what you did inside of the UI as well. And so I'm going to change it so that I can just say move myfile.txt into text files. But it's up to you how you want to do that. And you commit the changes. And now you'll see that we have this little file tree, and now there's a text files folder, and the file is inside of that. I can close out the folder and it goes away. So that's how those things work. And I put that into here. There's a little GIF of it. It's in the old format, so it looks a little bit different, but I didn't want to remake the GIF. So, but it's kind of fun. You can keep adding those and you can delete them to change them around. Now, the thing about Git is that it's not, Git stores files and it stores the path to those files, right? So just as we were talking about when I committed this change to where the file was, it didn't consider it a move. it considered it a renaming because it was changing the path. It was saying, this file isn't just called myfile.txt anymore. It's called text files / myfiles.txt. Git saves changes to files, and an empty folder is a path that leads nowhere. So it can't do anything with empty folders. You need to have a file at the end of the line. The path has to end in a file. So if you want to make a file, and you can't quite do it by uploading the file. So if we go into here and I say I want to add a new file, and this is in here in the slides too. So I can go and I can create a new file, and I'm going to say images to be my next folder that I want to create. And then this is a convention. This is not required. It's something that sometimes people do for the humans to see what it's there for, and is to type .keep. Because it's very often for hidden or sort of utility files, and keep is just sort of a convention to say, like, this is here just to keep this folder in existence. The file doesn't actually do anything. The name of it doesn't actually do anything. The whole thing that creates that keeps that folder in existence is the fact that there is any file inside of it. So we're going to make an empty folder by creating a file inside of it. I'm calling it .keep. You can call it something else if you want. So I'll commit that. I'm going to say create images folder, because the way I'm looking at it, that's mainly what I'm doing. So now that I've done that, if I go back up into my repository, my stunning carnival, now I have an images folder, and it has a file in it called .keep that isn't really useful to me, except that it keeps that images folder around. But inside of the images folder or inside of the repository, if I put the path in there, I can upload a file into there. And let's see. Have something in. Oh, I think. I don't know what that one is, so I'm going to wait on that. Oh, here we go. I know what that is. Okay. So I'm adding an image into my images folder, and add Jake to images, and we'll commit that to the main branch again. So now inside of the images folder, I have that image dancing around. And now that I have a file in here, I can delete this keep one if I want to. So I can go to keep, and let's see, actually, I don't remember how to delete. Go back up.
Anybody in the room now? Can you delete it?
Yeah, I forget.
Folder.
Just the file, the keep file.
Just the file .keep.
But click on the dot. It's not a supplemental.
Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's right there. I just didn't scroll enough. I'm way too zoomed in. All right, so we got rid of .keep. And now again, this is something that has to be committed. It looks like it's gone, but it's actually not gone yet until I commit that change. I'm still in essentially editing. So if I leave this page and I go over here to images, it keeps still there. I haven't deleted it because I haven't committed the change. So if I go into keep and I go to the ... and I scroll and select delete file, then I have to commit the changes. Everything you do, you have to commit. Now, most of the time you can't really save it without clicking commit, but this is an example of something where you seem to do the thing, but it doesn't stick until you commit. So I did that, and I'm going to commit that directly. So now it's gone, and all I have is my image inside the images folder. You can also just leave it. It's not that big of a deal. People know why they're there. So getting back to this, we're doing okay on time. Now, moving binary files inside of the GitHub UI is a little bit weird. because when you're looking at this binary file, you can see that there's nothing up here that lets me change the path that leads to it. So if you want to move it to another folder or another location, you have to actually delete the file. Well, download it first if you don't still have it locally. Download the file, delete it from Git, and then re-upload it into the new place. A little bit later, I will show you a different way to do that. That's not in the GitHub UI, but still fairly straightforward to do. But yeah, if you're working directly in the GitHub UI and you want to move a file from one place to another that's a binary file, you actually have to do that. Re-download it if you don't have it already, delete it, go to where you want it to be, and upload it again. So, so now we're at a try it stage, but I'm guessing that everyone has pretty much followed along with this. So we're okay with that? This is basically the steps that we just did, making a new repo with a README, editing it like we did, making a new file, creating a folder called images, and uploading an image to it. Oh, but there's this last one here. Add your new image to one of your markdown files. So, and there's a clue in it. So very often when these are longer workshops, we take a section of time and people work on this on their own. And then last one is kind of a bonus if you get ahead and you want to explore. But I think I'll just show it real quickly. So you want to have a relative link, which explains in here how to do relative links. With those, you just essentially, it's similar to if you've written relative links inside of web pages and things like that. It just starts at the beginning of the repository instead of starting with an HTTP or other protocol in the beginning. But the rest of it is in the regular Squirrel Markdown URL format. So if we go down in here, and let's see, I'm going to edit my README. And oh, that was disorienting because they changed the cat. That's something that happens when you have placeholder sites creating your images. Sometimes the images change. That's not the one that I uploaded for this. And let's see, I'm going to say, I'm going to change this to Dancing Jake the Dog. And in here, instead of putting in a full URL, I'm just going to put in the path to it. So the first part of the path starts at the very top images. So the highest folder that's, if it was nested down in further folders, you'd start with the first folder in the nesting list. So in this case, it's just images, and slash, and the name of the file. All right, let's preview it to make sure it worked. And there it is. So you can link to other files within the repository. So for example, I could link this over to my text file that was in here. Or, yeah. That one was in here. Right. And this stuff is actually quite useful if you're contributing to or writing on your own a repository that has lots of documentation in it. And very often that documentation is several pages of documentation, and the way that the readers might read it might be directly inside of GitHub. Sometimes it's built out to a regular documentation site, but very often in these projects, the writing is actually, the content is actually read in GitHub. And so you can make these relative links that will point to the other pages inside of GitHub. Now, if it does get published out to another site, sometimes those paths are not going to be the same. That's something that you would find out in that repository and how it works. We'll get to some of the details about contribution guides later, but we'll put this preview. Can't tell where that link goes for sure. Oh, well, yeah, it tells me down on the corner. Should be good. I can test it. All right, so it took me to my file where I wanted it to be. And I can commit those changes. And now I have my new README with Jake instead of a cat. And Jake will stay the same. It won't be a different cat every time I open the page. All right, any questions about that?
Not in the room.
Okay. We just got quiet on the online participants. All right, so those parts are pretty straightforward. You're kind of just clicking and adding and typing into different things. It gets a little bit complicated more when you start looking at forks and pull requests, and these come into play when you are working in someone else's repository. So everything we've done so far is in a repository that you created yourself. You have write permissions into that, so you can make changes. It belongs to you. It's something that you can work in. But you can also use GitHub to make contributions to other repositories that you don't have permission to make changes to it. So that's one of the things that's really cool about GitHub and tools like it, is that it enables open source contributions in a way that people who don't have edit access can make suggestions to make changes, and they can be reviewed, so unlike sharing a Google Doc with the world that anybody can edit, you're sharing this repository with the world and anybody can make suggestions, but it's not going to change your repository unless you give permission to admit those changes. So to show what that looks like, that works with forks and pull requests. And these are things that are added by GitHub on top of Git. They are not core to Git. They are used by other tools. GitLab, Bitbucket are examples of other services that work similarly, but it's not inherent to Git. So forking a repo, and I will say Git and GitHub mix their metaphors a lot. Sometimes they're talking about forks, sometimes they're talking about branches. So sometimes it's following a river, sometimes it's following a tree. In this case, it's a fork. I guess it's like a river. So when you want to make changes to a repo that you don't control, you can make a fork yourself, but GitHub will automatically make a fork. So let's say I'm going to say that I have this repository that I've made, and I'm going to switch over to my alter ego. My regular username is very thorough. My alter ego is not so thorough. And in here, when I'm logged in is not so thorough, I can go to that is not. This other repository doesn't belong to me. I don't have permission to make changes to this repository, but I can go in here and I can go to the README, and now it's telling you, hey, you don't actually have permissions to make changes directly to this repo. You need to make a fork to this repository to propose changes. And if you want, you can actually make those too if you want to mine. So there's a couple ways if you're following along with this. You can either talk to another person in the room, find out what their repository path is, or maybe if you're online, you can share a link to your repo, and then someone else in the class can go to your repo and try to make contributions. So I'm just going to put mine up in the chat. And then if you're in the room, you can also, if you want to, go to github.com/verythorough/stunning-carnival if you want. But when you go to make changes to this repository, you go into one of the files, you say, I want to edit. Then it tells you, hey, you need to fork this. And what that's doing is you're going to make a copy of the repository. So if I click this, and they're pretty good about embedding documentation along the way as you go. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can do so, not now. So click work this repository, and it's telling you, hey, you're making changes in a project that you don't have access to. Write access, you have read access, but not write. Submitting a change will write it to a new branch in your fork, which is my not so thorough fork. So you can send a pull request. So once I'm in this fork, you can see this says very thorough stunning carnival still, but it's actually going to change after I make some changes to it. So I have this, and I'm going to say, I'm going to take this one actually, as I recall. And this is interesting. It didn't have the file tree here for me when I open it up in the repo, but you can see here's this little. So if you don't have that list of the files next to your thing, you can go there to open it up. So I want to put in the Fox wave and waving Fox. And this one's not embedded in, like, saved inside the images folder. It's at the root, as they say, of the repository. So we can say just directly fox-wave.gif, because I'm working at the top of the repository as well. Which actually, that reminds me something I'll refer to later. If you're not at the top of the repository, sometimes you have to go back up a path and back down again in your relative links. There's an explanation of that inside of the relative links link that was in the slides here. I'm not going to get into that detail, but this one gives more details about relative links.
Jessica, we have a question in the room.
Yeah.
So forking is effectively making the local copy of
It's like a mirror. It's a little bit different in that it's sharing the same history, and it has greater awareness of where it came from. So if you make a mirror or a clone, well, a clone can be different, but if you make a mirror, it's independent, whereas a fork, if I go after I make this, so let's see, I've made my little change. I'm going to preview. So I've got both my images. I commit those.
And Jessica, just for clarification, I think the person in the room was asking if it's like a local copy.
It is not a local copy. Good question. Yes. So, okay, it is on GitHub. Now, it kind of feels weird because I'm playing two people at the same time right now. But this is in GitHub, up on the web, under my not so thorough username, whereas the other one was under my very thorough username. So I'm working in two different browsers with two different usernames, but it's still up in the cloud. So I'll show you.
But it's a second repo, isn't it?
It is, but it's not local.
Right.
So I'll show you. And it's unfortunate because it shows the old, because of the editing path that I'm taking, it's still showing the original, they call it the upstream version. So I'll close proposed changes.
I don't mean on a hard drive. I mean as a belonging to you.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So let me show this. Let's see. Oh, actually, I can just go straight to this one. So you see now on my very thorough doppelganger version of myself and not so thorough. So now I'm logged in as not so thorough in this browser, and I now have a copy of Stunning Carnival. And it's, as it says here, it's forked from Very Thorough's Stunning Carnival. So it will actually make a copy of the repository in your username. They used to actually have a little icon next to it too that showed that it was a fork. Now they just say, this is forked. And if I go to that repository, it shows this repository. It belongs to Not So Thorough, but it's forked from the version that belongs to Very Thorough. So this isn't local. This is still on the web, but it's in your user. It's a little bit confusing because I am the same user here, but it knows that it's forked from that, and it'll let you know where this repository is in relation to that other, what they call the upstream repository. It knows where it came from, and that's part of what makes a fork special. There's also some other rules about it, which is that forks of public repositories can't be private. There's a couple other things like that. So sometimes there are things you might want to do to take a repository, make it private, and forking isn't going to work. But you can. So what I did this time was I made a fork because I was making a contribution to another repository. But you can also, so I'm visiting the other very thorough one. This is the one that belongs to the original. You can just click this fork button as well and make your own copy of it here. I already have a fork as it's letting me know, or I could make a whole new fork if I wanted to. So does that make sense? It's still up on GitHub, but it's under your username instead of the original repository owner's username, but it is a copy of that repository.
Yeah, I think they got it.
But one thing to note, if changes happen on that original repository, they don't automatically change in your fork. Your fork can diverge, just like a river forks, and they go different paths. So as the original one changes, it won't automatically put those changes into your forked version. You have to pull those in. So what I'll show, so I've made this fork and I can actually do it from my own fork as not so thorough, or I can do it from the original. It's basically letting me know, hey, on your fork, you've got some changes that haven't been made at the upstream repository, at the original one that you forked from. If you want, you can compare those changes and make a pull request. So, and we have, I'm going to go back to the slides. And so it shows where it came from, how you can propose changes to it. So when you're in that fork, if I choose this compare and pull request, actually, I'm going to do it from my fork. So now this is making a comparison, and it actually went to that when I did the editing and I said to commit my changes. It actually gave me this comparison view automatically. But if you leave that comparison view, it gives you an option to look at it again. So what it's doing is it's saying, this is the base repository, and this is what you're working from. This is where you forked from. And this is the one that belongs to very thorough. And the base branch is main. We'll talk about branches in a minute. And then the head. So this is one of those places where the terminology in the metaphors gets a little bit weird, but the base is the main repository. The head is your repository, your changes, where you are, the last bit of your changes, what you want to commit into the main repository. So it's saying, hey, compare, this is where we're starting, and this is where we want to end up, is essentially what it's saying. And so I can add a title to my, my pull request, and automatically it fills in the commit that you made, or if you have multiple commits, your most recent. And then it has in here to create a pull request, and you can choose whether you want the maintainers, who are the people who own or can contribute to the original repository, to make edits to your pull request. You can say whether you do or not. I think often it makes it simpler to just allow it. But you can click the question mark and learn more about pros and cons in that. And then in here, you create the pull request. Oh,
we have another question in the room.
What is patch 1?
Oh, did you hear that? What is patch 1?
Patch 1, yes, yes. So we're going to talk about branches in a minute, but when I made my commit, they automatically made a branch called patch 1. And I'll explain what branches are after I finish this pull request, but that's what they've created, which is like a split. It's almost, not exactly, but it's kind of like a fork inside of a repository. But we'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead, and you'll see that it has the information about how to add your pull request. You might not have to scroll so much if you're not as zoomed in as I am, but it also below it shows your changes. And they call this a diff view. So in a diff, it shows lines that you've added in green and lines that you've removed in red. And the green ones have pluses and the red ones have minuses. And if you make a change to a line, it'll have a minus red line for the old version of that line, and then a plus green line for the new version of that line. But you can also see this is a version where it shows the diff in the formatted view. So this would be our formatted view, and it's saying, hey, you're going to add this one, has the green line next to it. So in the code view, it shows it across the whole line. And in the preview, it'll show it, and they have this, they kind of fold out stuff that's not relevant to your changes, but you can click that to open it up. But it'll have, in the preview, it'll have next to the line, green for things that are added, red for things that are removed. Not as useful as the code one if you're colorblind. And you can look at it in different ways too. This is a split view, which I think is very common for the way that you might see it inside of a pull request. Is what it's showing is the old version on the left side and the new version on the right side with the same kind of formatting to show the difference between one and the other. So, all right. So I'm happy with my changes and I have the information about it. And so now I'm going to create my pull request. And it looks an awful lot like making a commit. It just has this information about, I have a description for it, which is a little bit different from the commit message. You have a title, this is what's going to show up, and I'll show you in a minute. And then a description for, you might say, why you're doing it, or other details about the information. Sometimes the repository will actually request you provide some information. And then it shows the changes. So then I'm going to say, yes, I want to do it, and create a pull request. So what this has done, now I'm in the upstream repository. I'm in the very thorough one. And if I go back over to my very thorough self and refresh my page, I can see, oh, look, I have actually not one, but 3 pull requests. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who made pull requests. So you can see how these work. Now, that title that I entered, that's what shows up here. And it also says who made the pull request. And then I can look at this and see what's in it. You can see the view looks fairly similar. And I have the title. I know that this is wanting to commit into my main branch, and it's coming from this other fork belonging to Not So Thorough and a branch called Patch 1. And I can look through and see the commit message. And if there are multiple commits, it'll show them here. And if I go to Files Change as an owner of this repository, I can look and see, oh, these are the changes that were proposed. And I'm going to actually look at one of my other pull requests. And let's see what we've got here. This test can be accepted or rejected. Well, thank you, Yarnwindle, for I would be happy to accept your pull request. So let's see what Yarnwindle did in here. So I can look over here at the files changed, and there's a heading down here, test for forking. And actually, I'm kind of moving ahead in some of these slides, but it gives a good opportunity to say this. So I can see this and say, this didn't show up as a heading, and maybe we do want it to be. I'm going to come back to that one. So let's go to another pull request. And we have another file request changed. Oh, okay, we've got some markdown in here. Fantastic new text, and I can preview it. All right. And so now I can do this. I can look at this and go, okay, that looks good. And sometimes you might require reviews along the way, and I'm just going to say, actually, I'm going to skip the review on this one. We'll get to that. And I can take it and I can merge it. So this wasn't made by me. This was made by someone I've never met. And I can say merge pull request. And I have this information about the pull request and say confirm. And now if I go back into my Stunning Carnival, repository here in the README is new text written by somebody else. So that's how that kind of works from Josh does not have access to this repository, but Josh was able to make contributions and I was able to accept them. And now I have some fantastic new text that's been added to my README. Thank you, Josh. And so I'm going to go back to the slides for a minute. You proposed your change. You compare them.
Question on that, and thank you for merging my PR.
Yes.
If you had wanted to set it up, configure it differently so that you, as the original owner, got an email or something, can you do that?
Yeah.
Right when somebody forks it, or when they submit a PR, pull request?
I'm not positive if you can get a notification when there's a fork, but inside of GitHub, inside your settings, there's quite a bit of options for configuring your notifications. So you can say how you want to be notified for them. Like I have actually turned it off so I don't get email notifications for most things, but you can turn on email and you can do that by specific repository as well. It's pretty granular. And so, yeah, they have quite a few options in it, and they have some documentation on that as well, on how to, on each of your repositories, you can decide whether they're watched or unwatched, and then what your settings are on that. You will definitely have the option to get an email when there's a pull request or a new issue filed. We'll talk about issues in a minute. Forks, you might or might not, I don't remember, but you definitely can get it on the PR. Okay, so going on. Now, this is where we'll start talking about branches. So you saw that when I made a change in here, and you can see it here, it automatically made a branch called patch 1. Patch is kind of a convention for a small change in software. And then 1 they do because you might have multiple patch branches and they just start tagging numbers on them so that they don't all have the same name. But you could create branches of different names. So, and you can see in this example, this branch, patch 1, and this is actually true in my not so thorough repository. Let's see. Let's get it in here. So in my not so thorough, this is where your branches are, and it now says I have 2 branches. And if I look at those branches, I have main, and in main, updating the README 23 minutes ago was the last commit, and that was actually done on the original repository. If I go to patch 1, add waving fox is my most recent commit because that's the one that I did in my branch. So branches can have different commit histories. This, if you look at all the commits that have been made, this has the most recent one that was made by Very Thorough before, and it also has the waving fox one that I made. You'll note that it doesn't have the one that was made upstream over here from Josh. So this one is the most recent one in the main one, but it's not the most recent one on my fork. That's where they can diverge. So that's how you have 2 different branches. You have many branches. Some repositories have a great many branches. Let me get back to the slides. So one thing that can be useful for branches, so all the things that we've been doing up to this point, we've been changing a single file at a time. So you might not necessarily need a branch for it. You're just making a commit to your main thing, or you're making a change in your repository and you just want that one file to get changed in somebody else's in the upstream. But if you want to make a group of changes together, oh, we got a new person in the waiting room. If you want to make a group of new changes together, then you can create a new branch for that. So inside of the UI, if I go to here, you can, if you have lots of branches, you can type a name and it'll find that branch for you. Like if I started typing main, it would find that one, although it's right there already. So I can say like my big changes branch, whatever you want. If that branch doesn't exist, it gives you the option to create that branch. And it's creating it from main. So it's creating it from whatever branch you're on, which means it'll have the same history as that branch that you started from. And if I made it from my patch 1 branch, it would have the same history as patch 1. It'll just have all those same commits and be in the same state as the one that you're branching from. So I'm going to create this new branch. And so you can see this is on the same last commit in this branch, my big changes branch, as in my main branch. And I'm not going to worry about protecting my main branch. You can read about that documentation later. Essentially, it makes it so you don't make accidental commits or one person making a commit without approval to your main branch. This is actually the default branch. You set that in GitHub. The default is main. But in past times, you might see master in some older repositories. Some repositories use a totally different name for their main branch. But the default branch is always going to be marked. And then when you're in another branch, because you know what the default one is, it'll let you know in other branches if you're up to date with the default one. Because it's assuming that where you want to be working towards is your default, which is usually the case, but not always. And so that's one way of, it always kind of stays aware of the default one as you're working. So let's see. We have this branch now, and I can make changes inside of this branch to multiple files. So now I'm inside big changes, and maybe I'm going to go into my README, and I'm going to make a change in here. And I'm going to commit that one. And see here, I'm committing directly to the big changes branch. If I hadn't created that branch, I could have chosen this create a new branch and make it a totally other branch. This is a different way of creating an additional branch. But won't worry about that right now. So I'm going to cancel. No, I'm not going to cancel. I'm going to commit directly to the branch that I've already created and commit those changes. So now I've got the WoW here in this version, but you can see I can change to my main branch. It's not there. And I go back to my big changes branch, and I'm also going to go into images, and I'm going to add a new file. Let's see what we got in here that might be. Oh, well, we got Jake. We'll add Finn. Okay. Okay. Add Finn. And this is also going to be committing to my big changes branch. So now in my big changes branch, I have not only my WoW added to my text, but I also have a new image in here, my Finn dance. And if I switch back to main, that's not there. And the WoW's not there. So inside of my repository, or if I were working in a fork, I could go and now when I do this, if I go back to repository, it's saying, hey, that branch that you made, so you can make pull requests to someone else's repo from a fork, but you can also make pull requests within your own repository or in a repository that you have write access to. So I have here compare and pull request. So it's saying, hey, you made a couple of changes in your big changes branch and they're different from main. Did you want to make a pull request of those? So I can move all of those changes over at the same time. Now, why might you want to do that? Sometimes just because it's easier for people to interpret. If you're only doing one file at a time, it can end up being a lot of pull requests. Another thing is, well, let's say that I wanted to actually put this picture of, back to big changes, I want to put this picture of Finn into my README. Well, I can't do that without uploading the Finn image, right? So I would have to do both of those files at the same time. So actually, why not do that? Okay. And let's double check. Looks good. So if I go back here and it says, hey, you made some changes to big changes, make a pull request. And when it compares those, it has all 3 of those commits that I made. Those are all the commits that are different from the main one, from the one I'm comparing to. It's not just one commit now. And it has different files. So I had 2 different changes made to my README file. I changed this line. You can see how it has the minus red and the plus green on a changed line. And I added these lines. And I added my little Finn dance file. That's a great little dance. And by default, when you're doing it from a branch, it names it after the branch. So I'm going to say add dancing Finn. Oop. Okay. And I'm going to create my pull request. And then it's checking to make sure that there aren't any conflicts where Git tries to figure out the changes that you want to make and how to apply them, and sometimes it isn't sure. And we'll get into that a little bit. And then as the user, I can merge this one. And now you'll see when I go back into the main repository, it doesn't say here anymore. It'll say big changes is 1 commit behind main, because I made that branch before another commit was made inside of main. So don't need to make those. But you can see now in main, the changes that I made, the wow and the dancing Finn, are now in the README. So those all got pushed in at once. So that is why it made that patch 1. That's kind of what branching means when you do that. So got through that. Oh, we're getting kind of along in time. So that's what it means to make a branch and to make those. So then you can have multiple files inside of a pull request. So we've kind of done most of these, and in the interest of time, I think I'm going to kind of go past this one, but hopefully you had a chance to look at someone else's repo, make a file, make a fork, make a branch, do those things. This is also a great thing to try doing afterwards on your own to see how you've retained it. Go back to the other slides if you get stuck. Now, this is where I want to get to commenting on PRs. And I stopped myself when I was reviewing another PR. So I'm going to get to this part. So this is the PR comments. So if I go back to my repository and I go to my pull request, oh, and I don't think I said PR is short for pull request. And in other tools, you actually might see merge request, but almost all the time people will say PR because pull request is, I don't know, more of a mouthful. But we'll go back into here. And if I look at this pull request, there's this conversation tab, and it starts with a comment. The first comment is actually the description you wrote when you made your PR. And inside of the repository, you'll see that one. And then I can also make comments on the repository, or on the pull request, sorry. So I can make comments here. This is a general comment. And I can comment there. And I'm going to come back to this conflict. It's another very useful thing. So inside of this, I could make a general comment where I might say, hey, thanks for the contribution. Could you make sure you do X, Y, and Z? I can also go and I can make inline comments. And this can be particularly useful for documentarians. One great way to contribute to open source can be to do a writer's review of documentation pull requests. So someone else maybe has written documentation for something and they've made a PR for it. You can go in and you can review it. And we have this option for inline comments. So every line has a little plus button next to it, and you can click on that plus and comment specifically on that line. And if it's a long pull request with lots of text, that can be particularly useful. And I can say, I think this needs a space if you want it to show as a heading. So as you might recall, when I looked at the preview, this didn't turn into a heading. It left that little number sign. And I do this myself. Oh, I knew that was going to happen when I changed. I think this needs a space. And so you can put in a comment that's directly in the spot where you need. And then one particularly cool thing is I love this, particularly for reviewing writing, especially when you're reviewing a whole paragraph of text. And a paragraph in Git is just a single line. So it's really hard. You can't just unless people write it in such a way where they add spaces, add line breaks. But typically a paragraph is just a single line. And so if you want to comment on put a comma after the and in the third sentence of the paragraph, that can be a real pain. And so they have this cool tool called Add a Suggestion. And it puts in this kind of weird looking formatting where it puts these tick marks and says suggestion. And then I can make changes in here. And you can see in the preview what it's going to look in my comment is when I make a suggestion, it creates this. So clicking that button made the formatting for me, which is nice. And then it makes this little box that says, hey, here's a suggested change. What we want to do is we want to change it. So instead of this line, it's going to be this line, which just adds a space. That's all. And so once I've done that, I can say, hey, that's what I want to suggest that you add a space in here. And I can add that as a single comment, or I can do it as a review. So I can just add this as a comment that sits standalone, or I can go in here and I can say, thanks for making a contribution and a suggestion formatting. And I'm going to say request changes. A comment just leaves a comment. Approving it means everything's good, no changes needed. But this one I'm going to say, hey, I'd like some changes to it. Okay, so it made the general comment for my review in here. And then if you go into the files changed, where's my comment? I did not save it correctly. All right, I'm going to do this part again. Make a suggestion. I'm not going to put the extra stuff in it. I clicked up here and said review changes, which forgot that I was doing the inline comment. So when you make your inline comment, and I've made this little suggestion in here, you click start a review. And what that does is maybe you're reviewing a whole long file or multiple files in a PR, and you have lots of comments and suggestions that you want to make along the way. When you say start a review, what it'll do is save your comments so that only you can see them. This is pending right now, so only I can see this comment. So if anyone else goes into this repository and goes to this pull request, they're not going to see this comment yet because I'm still building my review. And you can see up here where it says finish review, it's saying you've got one inline comment stored up. If I have multiples, it would put that in there. And this is my review with actual comments in it. And now I'm going to say request changes. and you can see it's got one pending comment. However many inline comments I had, it's going to deliver those with my review. So now you can see what it looks like inside of, this is in the conversation tab, and it puts them all together in a thing. It says the general comment, and then it shows the inline comments. And if I go over here to the files change view, it'll also show them. And you'll see it has this option to commit the suggestion. So Yarnwindle, if you open up this pull request on your computer and you go to this, you can actually commit the suggestion. And what it'll do is it'll save it to your branch inside of your fork. But let's say I did something else and I said, hey, I want you to make changes. This is something that I got stuck on at first when I first started doing open source contributions, is that you'd make a pull request and then someone would say, can you make a change here? And I thought, oh, refresh. Woo. There, it's changed. So, and if I look at the commits, you can see now there's 2 commits. I love it. Great idea. So Yarnwindle made a change, and it actually shows both of us because I made the suggestion and Yarnwindle applied it. Yeah, that got added in, and it also shows up there in the commits. So going back to that. Oh, yes. When making a pull request and someone would make a suggestion or a request to change my PR, I wasn't quite sure how to make changes to that pull request without making a new one. Well, what turns out to be the case is any commits that you make to your original branch that made the pull request, so if that's in your fork in the patch 1 branch, or it's a branch that's inside of your own repository, any changes that you make to the branch that's in that pull request will actually be added to that pull request, just like what happened with this one here, updating the README. I mean, I can actually look at those commits and see in that commit the change that was made in it. So that was something I wasn't quite sure about when I first did it. And the other thing that can be tricky about this is you make another pull request with the same branch name, it's going to have all the changes of both. So you have to actually make a new branch name if you're making another pull request. That ends up being relevant if you're doing lots of pull requests. Like I've been at like open source coding events where you're making contributions multiple times in a night, and then you have to make sure that they're in separate branches or else they get smushed together into the same PR. So did that make sense? It gets a little bit weird with forks and PRs and branches.
Jessica, is there a way to pull the latest changes from a main, like from a repository into a fork?
Yes, and there didn't used to be, and that was one of the big limitations of using the GitHub UI. So let's see, let's get back over to here. I have this one. And actually, I also wanted to, in this pull request, go to the conflicts. So I'm actually going to do this part first while it's still here. And then I'll get to the other part. So what this is doing is, because 2 different people have made pull requests and one of them's already been merged into main. So since Yarnwindle made a pull request, we merged another pull request and some changes from me, and some of them were in the same file. So now GitHub's saying, well, Git itself actually is saying, I'm not sure which changes you actually want. And so that's what they call a merge conflict. It tries to figure out which things go where, but sometimes it doesn't know. And that's where you end up with these merge conflicts to resolve. And it has kind of this weird UI for it. But what it's saying is, look, I've got all of these different additions. I got this test for forking. I got this dancing fin that was added. I got this fantastic new text that was added. I'm not sure where they're all supposed to go or which things you want to keep. And so what you can do is you can actually just edit it so that it looks the way that you want it to. So sometimes what you can do, basically, I can actually, let's say I want to move this down. I can go down here and I can get rid of this weird stuff. I apparently have caps lock on. So all the stuff that they put in there to show me that it was that, I can put that change and mark it as resolved and commit it. Another thing that can be done is, well, actually, I'm going to mark this one as resolved and do it. So I marked it as resolved. I said, this is the way I want it to look. And then I'm going to commit that change that I made. So basically I said, okay, I get that you were confused. Here's what it should look like and how stuff should go together. Sometimes, you know, it's the order, maybe one of those lines I'm going to pull out. And now there's another commit inside there. And with those 3 commits, now it's got, oh, and I should point out this is not the whole file. It hid most of the file because it's not relevant to the change, but there's always these little like things to unfold and open up parts that were hidden for your convenience. So now it changed the order and it's like, okay, now I know what to do with all these things. Now, if I go, actually, I'm going to go ahead and merge this one now. It's been open for a while. Oh, I got to re-review. So let's go back in here. And I'm going to say, awesome. And you'll probably see this sometimes in repositories, this LGTM, which I learned meant looks good to me. And a lot of people think that. Turns out there's also a lot of people who think it stands for let's get this merged. So could mean either one. Both of them basically mean go for it, but has slightly different shading to it. I'm going to go ahead and approve. And I'm going to merge this pull request. There's different options with merging. I'm not going to get into them on this one, but you can see how that all worked. And now if I go back into my code for Stunning Carnival, I've got all the new stuff in here. So cool. But if I go back over to my fork here for Stunning Carnival, I go to my main. Actually, I'm going to do the one that I'm contributing with. It has this button here now. This didn't used to be here. It was like super frustrating because then you'd have to like refork or something like that, or go to more. It used to be when I did this workshop, I'd say if you start hitting this, then you end up having to use the GitHub CLI or Git CLI locally on your computer. But now I can just click this thing and say sync fork. But oh, it's actually upset because I have conflicts that need to be resolved. And I can go over to my pull request and let's go back into my pull request. Where is it? There it is. And this is where it's going to tell me I've got those conflicts, just like I did in the other one. And now I'm just going to put all the pictures together. So I actually just like the order the way it is. That's cool. I'll mark that as resolved. Merge conflicts are definitely, I would say, one of the more frustrating things about Git and GitHub and open source contributions. They can be kind of confusing and frustrating. Usually if you're working in text files and docs and things like that, and there aren't a whole lot of people contributing to the same file at the same time, you won't run into them very much, but they are one of the more challenging aspects. Switching back over to this one. Now if I go in here and I go to my patch 2, oh, no, this is not my, oh, I'm on the wrong user. That's right. Okay, back into my main branch. So I am at, oh, now I'm in the very thorough one. I want to be in my fork. So I'm going to go back into my repositories, open up my fork. Okay, so now I have this thing in here. It's saying, hey, you're 10 commits behind. There have been 10 other commits made into the main repository since you forked it. And so I can go here and I can say sort fork, and it's saying, hey, you're out of date. And I can just straight up updated font, or I can look and compare and say, well, what's different? Sometimes you have to switch things around. This says try switching the base. And it explains what that means, but I've also switched the base and it says, oh, here's all the changes and here's what it looks like. So then I can know if I sync the changes, that's what's going to happen to my repository before I do it. So I'm going to go back to where I was. And I'm going to sync my fork and update my branch. It's so nice that you can just do it with a button now. It was really frustrating before. So now it's up to date. So that's what happens if you end up behind and you can just use that button to catch up. And we're getting relatively close to the end. So let me switch. So there's some things in there. This is assuming that people have made a pull request to your repository. Feel free to invite people to do so. Oh, I have a new message in the chat. Oh, got a question in the room. That was answered, correct? Yeah.
Oh, no, I think we have
Oh, no,
another
it's new.
question.
Yeah, that's only like a minute ago. Yeah. Question.
So if a commit is X changes ahead, and Y changes behind. X is U changes they don't ahead, and Y is changes behind, and they have changes that you don't. Right, so it can be
so
be both ahead and behind at the same time.
Yeah, this is true. You can end up behind their changes and then they're behind your changes. I mean, they actually are, right? Because my my fork, which I'm not in my fork again. Here we go. My fork has it pulled in the other changes, but my fork also has the commit that I made that's sitting in my PR. So, and it'll often say that you're so many commits ahead and behind at the same time. So I'm no longer behind on the commits. Oh, and I'm looking at me. That's why that's not helping me. In patch 1, so here, it says in patch 1, I'm 1 commit ahead of the upstream repo and 10 commits behind, because I've made my 1 commit that's in my pull request that hasn't been merged yet. And then I also have all those 10 commits that happened before. I've only updated my main branch, so I actually need to sync my fork. And then I've got the merge conflict again. So I'm not going to worry about that, but that can happen. So like I'll pull in those syncs or fix my merge conflict because it happens to have one. That's not always the case when you're behind. And then I sync my fork. And then once I've done that, then I'll just be 1 commit ahead of and no longer 10 commits behind. It'll add those other commits into my history, and then I'll still have my 1 commit that it doesn't have, and that's what's in my PR. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's a little.
Thank you.
Okay. And okay, back to my slides. Okay, so I just wanted to put a note in here that when you're making contributions to open source repositories, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking. You're kind of putting yourself out there in public. It's totally normal for a pull request to require changes. Like, it's just because someone says, hey, can you add a space here? Or this, I think we should do in this other way. Or what if you did it this way? That's totally normal, fully experienced people. That it's meant to be a conversation. It's meant to be that you are saying, what if we do this? And they can say, yes, but this. When you get requests like that, don't be afraid to ask questions for clarification. That's totally normal as well, to say like, okay, I think I know what you mean, but is it like this? And most maintainers are friendly and helpful. And if you find that one is not, then maybe they don't deserve your free labor. And you can find another community that has better, kinder open source contributor or maintainers. And there are some that are not. So like, it's good to kind of look for ones that are friendly, and I'll give you some tips on how to find that stuff up. We talked about pushing changes to a PR already and merging the PR. The one other main thing to show is issues. And those are inside of repositories. Every repository has a thing for issues. These are for basically talking topics about, it's a little bit different from discussions, but issues are often created when you find a bug in a repository and you say, hey, I found this bug, I'm going to report it as an issue. Or if there's something that a repository needs, like if I have an open source project and something that I've been meaning to do, I can create an issue to say, do XYZ, and I can track that. It also means, though, that someone else might come along, find that issue and go, oh, I could do that. And then they just do it for you, which is actually kind of amazing and magical. But if you go to, for example, this Write the Docs repository, and I go to issues, this is a public repo, and it has a bunch of different issues submitted on here that people have put in to say, hey, the API content is outdated, or here's a suggestion to do this. Sometimes they're bugs, sometimes they're suggestions, sometimes they're feature requests, sometimes they're, we need to document this, and I'll show you some examples of that. So issues are a great way to find places, find things that repositories are looking for help on. So these are basically a task list very often, and you can go and look for issues and say, oh, I can help with that. And anyone who has read access to a repository can open a new issue or comment on an existing one. And you can filter through them and look for ones that have particular labels and things like that. And I'll show you some things about some tools that are out there for finding particular kinds of issues. But if we go inside of an issue that says, hey, API content is outdated, says some information about it, people can have responses to it, and you can have a conversation about that. And you can also jump into that issue and say, oh, I'd be happy to update this. So you can come in and you can claim it, especially if you're at some sort of like hack night or something like that, where lots of people are contributing to an open source project. Really good idea to make a note inside of the issue and say, oh, I'm going to work on this, so you don't end up like duplicating work with someone else. Now, something that we didn't really have time to get into in this and our closing thoughts is things beyond the web UI. So the web UI you can do a lot of different stuff with, but there are some limitations. One that used to be in this slide was that whole thing about syncing up with the upstream repository. No longer an issue, so that's cool. But some more complex merge conflicts, in the web UI, it'll just say, I don't even know what to do with this. This is too confusing, so go deal with it inside locally. Sometimes it can be difficult to preview changes if you're working in a repository that the results of it aren't in the repository. It's actually some, something that runs. Maybe it builds us a doc site and you want to see what it looks like in the built site, things like that. You can't change multiple files in a single commit. You can make multiple single file commits inside of a branch, but you can't change files in a single commit. And like I had said, moving binary files is kind of a pain. So normally what previously would have been the suggestion was, okay, now you need to start working locally, you clone it down, and there's tools for that inside of the repository. And there's a lot of things that come into that. You need to make sure you have Git installed in your computer. You need to have perhaps other software dependencies that are needed to run the code in that repository. You need to be running your terminal, which might use a different format than other terminals. If you're running Windows and you're in PowerShell, some of the paths and some of the commands are going to be different than commands if you were in a Mac or Linux environment. Now GitHub's got code spaces, and it's basically like working locally, but up inside of the cloud, and it's pretty great. So I'm going to show an example of this. Inside my Stunning Carnival, I can go from this repository and I can just say create code space on main. And what that does is it makes something that behaves like a local machine. It's running software, it's got a command line prompt. It's actually the exact same user interface as if you were running Visual Studio Code locally on your computer. But it's all running in a sandbox container up in the cloud that you can open and reopen and work in from GitHub. something that's really nice about that, I don't need to install Git on my computer. I don't need to have those other things. I can actually run from the command line in here. There might be other things I could do with that. If I needed to run software to build the site or something like that, I could do that. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But one thing that's really cool as a short thing to show, so it gives me all these features in here. Let's say I want to move Foxwave into my images folder. I can do that. And previously, if I was working on the web, I'd have to download it, delete it, upload it to a new spot. And here, I got this file tree. I can just drag it over. It'll say, hey, did you want to do that? Yes, I do. Now it's in here in the file tree. And this is essentially saving it locally to my code space. It's not changing it in the repository. So I changed it here. And if I go to the repository, it's still down there. It hasn't changed. But if I go down to the source control, little sort of Git branching icon, I can go in here and I can commit those changes. It actually shows me my whole Git history, which I'm not going to get into. But it's also got my changes, which is basically saying delete foxwave.gif from the root level and add it into the images folder. And I'll put a little message to say move Foxy and commit. Now, there's a concept of staging, and I'm not going to get into it because it's a little bit more into Git stuff, but it's the idea of you can take all the changes that you've made, you can actually choose which ones you want to commit at a time. So maybe you're like, I want to take these couple ones and just commit those and then commit others later. In this case, what you can do is you can just say commit, and it'll say, you haven't staged any. Do you want to just stage them all right now? And you can say, yeah, go ahead. And what that did was that made a new commit right here, move Foxy, that's inside of my code space. And it's not inside the repository. I haven't made that new commit. The Fox one hasn't moved. But if I go into my, into here, in the Git thing, it doesn't have any new changes, and I can say sync changes. And if I mouse over, it says, oh, push one commit to origin. Origin is the name of the repository that it came from, and to the main branch. And I can say, okay, this will pull and push commits. I'm not getting into too much detail here, but you can do more stuff in this. And what I like about it is that there are some other tools for graphically doing these things. And you can see now it's moved in. I've got the new commit and it's in there. But what I like about this is once you do move towards, if you want to start working locally, working in the CLI, you can also make commits inside of the terminal down here. It's all the same language. It's all the same functionality. They don't change those things. And that's what I like, is that it works as a really nice intermediate step. So that's kind of what I say in the next few slides about this exists. It's pretty cool. I put a link to what VS Code is. And I also put a link to, oh, wait, there, to this GitHub code spaces that has a getting started guide. If you wanted to dig into that and explore what that's like, you can. It has a lot more functionality, but it's a little bit steeper learning curve once you get to it. But once you're comfortable with the web UI, it's a good next step. And let's see. Okay, so you've done this. You've made contributions to the super cool, stunning Carnival repository. Now maybe you'd like to actually go make some out in the world. I put together a few repositories that are good ones for making contributions with little or no code. One concept is awesome lists, and this repository is actually an awesome list of awesome lists. So awesome lists are lists of awesome things in a particular category. So like, let's say you want to look at awesome programming languages, or some good ones down in here that are like, oh yeah, that's right. I don't know, awesome lists about web animation. So each one of these is a repository, and inside that repository, it's just a list of links. So it's a really easy thing to contribute to. And if it's something that you happen to know about, you can go, oh, okay. So I want to go into this repository. It's all about web animation, and it's got links to a bunch of different things that have to do with web animation. I happen to know about a tool that would be really great for this. I can click on the README, I can add a link to the tool and a little description and make a PR. So that's kind of a simple one you can contribute to. TLDR pages is an example of documentation that goes inside of the command line. They actually have a huge list of really great issues for things that need to be documented. This is a super friendly and well updated. You can see that pull requests get responded to often, like all these closed pull requests that were merged 2 weeks ago, 6 hours ago, last week. So you're not going to make a pull request and have it sit for days or weeks or months or years. Some of these have really old pull requests in them, so that's a good thing to check. And then also Write the Docs itself has that main website that I showed you, and it gets updated regularly. San Francisco's Write the Docs group wrote a book inside of Git called The Lone Writer's Guide you can contribute to. And we're getting super close to the end. Sorry about that. There's also programs to encourage newcomers and documentarians. Hacktoberfest happens every October. Come around next year for that one. Season of Docs is something that Google does that is a fellowship and stipend for technical writers working on open source. This has a bunch of links to tools and sites for finding repositories that have lots of issues that you can contribute to, and you can search for documentation issues, etc. Another thing is to look for PRs with a documentation label. So this is a specific GitHub search filtering in GitHub that says in all of GitHub and all of the open source repositories around the world, what pull requests have a documentation label added to it? And so these are all ones that someone has made a pull request to documentation. So you could go to that pull request and you could go and review it. You could go and look at this documentation and you can make code comments on it. This one is written in RST. So if you're familiar with that text language, you can do it. Maybe you want to look instead for one that's in Markdown or another language that you're familiar with. I need to go back. Oh no, there's my slides. One thing that's good to do when you're considering contributing to one, like I said, is look at the frequency of pull request merges, and then also to look at their community profile, which I'm trying to find an example of a repository. Oh, this will work. So you can find information about here in the code of conduct, but they also have this insights tab that'll tell you how many contributors, if you have other information about how frequently it's done. And then in here, there are community standards, and it shows you, does this have a README? Does it have a code of conduct? Does it have a guide to contributing? These don't necessarily mean that it's a useful contributing guide, but it's a bit of a signal that you can use to find out, like, is this something that's going to be helpful for me? Have they taken the time to do some of this work? You can also watch the repos of tools or programs that you use and look for issues, and if things come along as you're getting familiar with it, you can make contributions there. I also put a few links that you can read from GitHub, from other sources. I kind of liked this story from one particular person about her journey into open source and what it was like and some of the emotional components of that. And then also within Write the Docs Slack, there is an open source channel. So you can always go in there and talk to other people about what they're working in or what they like, things like that. So that brings me to the end. So thanks, everyone. I know we only have like 2 minutes left, and I'm guessing that, Rachel, you probably want to close things off. So if you have questions that you want to follow up on, I am in the Write the Docs Slack. My username is Very Thorough, and so you can feel free to ping me anytime in there and ask questions, or I don't know, find the Carnival repo and file an issue. You could do that too. So thanks,
I
everyone.
think we have one question in the room.
Sure.
We're
Mhm.
going to get a copy of this presentation, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so let me go back to the very first slide. I think I can do it this way.
Links otherwise.
Yeah, and the video, I believe, is recorded. Well, it is recorded for sure. And then I think that the Write the Docs group puts it up on YouTube. That happened before when we did an online one, and you're
Yeah,
using
I
that
think
account, right?
it should. I think
Yeah.
I have to take some action to make that happen, perhaps, but that is the intent. Yes.
Yeah, so if you want to go to the slides, you can go to this verythorough.com/slides/GitHub-web. And also if you're in the Write the Docs Slack, you can ping me and I can send you the link. And then also, oh, and you know what? I'll put it in the comments for the meetup as well. I'll put a comment in the meetup with a link to the slides. And then also, when the video gets posted, there'll be that too. So,
All right.
thanks.
So I just wanted to say thank you to Jessica. Let's give her a round of applause. We really appreciate your time and thank you so much.